Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People's Story. 3 years ago, my wife and I moved into what we thought would be our dream home. It was in a nice neighborhood with well-maintained properties and good schools nearby. The house itself was perfect for us. 3 bedrooms, a big backyard for our dog, and even a finished basement where I could set up my home office. There was just one catch. The dreaded HOA. I'd heard horror stories about HOA before, but the real estate agent assured us this one was reasonable and not like those crazy ones you hear about. What a load of crap that turned out to be. For the first 6 months, things were fine. We paid our dues on time, kept our lawn mowed, and generally followed the rules. I even went to a couple of meetings just to be a good neighbor. That's where I met him, the HOA president, a retired guy in his 60s who clearly had nothing better to do than patrol the neighborhood looking for violations. Let's call him Mr. President. Mr. President seemed decent enough at first. He shook my hand, welcomed me to the neighborhood, and acted like a normal human being. But I quickly realized it was all an act. Within weeks of meeting him, we got our first violation notice for having our trash cans visible from the street for more than 24 hours. The fine was $50. I was annoyed, but paid it to avoid causing trouble. Then came more violations. Our grass was half an inch too tall. Our Christmas decorations stayed up 3 days past the January 5th deadline. Our mailbox was non-regulation color, even though it was the same one that came with the house. Each violation came with a fine, and each fine was signed personally by Mr. President. I tried to appeal some of these fines at the HOA meetings, but it was useless. Mr. President ran those meetings like a dictator, dismissing concerns and ruling with an iron fist. He had a small group of retirees who backed him up on everything, and together they made up the majority of the HOA board. This is ridiculous, I told my wife after receiving a $75 fine for having a garden hose visible in our front yard. It's like living under a microscope. She sighed. I know, but what can we do? We're stuck with the HOA as long as we live here. She was right, but that didn't make it any easier to stomach. I started documenting everything, taking photos of our property before and after any changes, keeping receipts for lawn maintenance, and saving all communications with the HOA. Little did I know how important this documentation would become. The real trouble started about a year ago. I had ordered a collectible model car online, a rare 1967 Corvette Stingray that I'd been searching for to complete my collection. It wasn't cheap, costing over $300, but I'd been saving up for it. The package was scheduled to arrive on a Tuesday while I was at work, and I had arranged for it to require a signature. My wife was going to be home that day to receive it, but that morning she got called into an emergency meeting at work. She texted me, "Won't be home for package. Can you pick it up tomorrow at post office?" I replied, "No problem. I'll get it tomorrow." When I got home that evening, I was surprised to see a delivery notification email saying the package had been delivered and signed for. That was odd. I checked our front porch, but there was nothing there. I checked with our neighbors on either side. Nothing. Then I remembered that our security camera covered the front porch. I checked the footage, and what I saw made my blood boil. Mr. President had walked up to our porch around 2 p.m., picked up the package that had been left there, so much for requiring a signature, looked directly at the camera, and walked away with my package. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't a case of porch pirates or a delivery mistake. The president of our HOA had stolen my package in broad daylight. I immediately called the non-emergency police line to report the theft. The officer who took my report seemed sympathetic but not particularly hopeful. "Do you have proof it was him?" she asked. "Yes, I have video footage from my security camera," I said. "That's good. We'll send someone to talk to him tomorrow. But honestly, if it's a first offense, he'll probably just get a warning." I wasn't satisfied with that answer, but I didn't see what else I could do at the moment, so I waited for the police to handle it. The next day, a different officer called me back. "I spoke with Mr. President about your package," he said. "He claims he was just holding it for safekeeping since no one was home. Says he was going to bring it to you this evening at the HOA meeting." "That's complete bull," I started but caught myself. "Officer, he didn't leave a note, he didn't text or call me, and the HOA meeting isn't until next week. He stole my package." "Well, here's the thing," the officer replied, sounding uncomfortable. "He's already handed the package over to me, and I can return it to you. So technically there's no theft if the property is returned." I was fuming, but I agreed to pick up my package at the police station. When I got there, I immediately noticed that the box had been opened and resealed with different tape. I opened it right there in front of the officer, and sure enough, the model car inside was damaged. The windshield was cracked, and one of the doors was hanging loose. "Look at this," I said, showing the officer. "He opened it and damaged it." The officer shrugged. You'd have to prove he did that damage. Could have happened during shipping. I knew there was no point arguing further. The police weren't going to help me, but I wasn't ready to let this go, not by a long shot. That evening, I sent an email to the entire HOA board with the video footage attached, describing what had happened and demanding Mr. President's resignation. I also requested compensation for my damaged collectible. The response I got was infuriating. The HOA secretary, one of Mr. President's cronies, replied, "The board has reviewed your complaint and finds no evidence of wrongdoing. Mr. President was acting in accordance with HOA Bylaw 7.3, which authorizes board members to secure packages to prevent theft. Your request for compensation is denied, and the board considers this matter closed. I checked the HOA bylaws. There was no such provision. They were making things up now." The next day, I ran into Mr. President while walking my dog. He had the audacity to smirk at me. "Got your little toy car back, did you?" he said. "You should thank me for keeping it safe." I was speechless with anger. He chuckled and walked away. That night, I could barely sleep. I kept thinking about how this man had not only stolen from me, but was now gloating about it. The HOA board was covering for him. The police wouldn't help, and I felt completely powerless. But the next morning, an idea started to form. If the system wouldn't give me justice, maybe I needed to take matters into my own hands. Over the next few weeks, I developed my plan. I also documented every interaction with Mr. President and the board. I sent formal complaints, requested financial audits of the HOA, which were suspiciously denied, and generally made myself a thorn in their side, all while being completely above board and following every rule to the letter. During this time, I discovered I wasn't the only one who had issues with Mr. President. Many of my neighbors had similar stories of unfair fines, intimidation, and even missing packages, but everyone was too afraid of retaliation to speak up. The HOA had the power to place liens on homes for unpaid fines, and Mr. President wasn't shy about threatening to use that power. Then came the opportunity I'd been waiting for. Mr. President announced he was going on a 2-week cruise. He made a big show of it at the HOA meeting, bragging about his ocean view suite and all the exotic ports they'd visit. He also announced that violations would still be enforced while he was gone, and he'd appointed another board member to keep an eye on things. The night before Mr. President left for his cruise, I put on dark clothes, grabbed a flashlight, and slipped out of my house around 2 a.m. I had a backpack containing several items, a small bag of quick-setting concrete mix, a bottle of water, a mixing container, and a small trowel. I had researched this carefully. The concrete I chose would set in about 30 minutes and be fully hardened in a couple of hours. I made my way to Mr. President's house, staying in the shadows. His mailbox was one of those standard black metal ones mounted on a post at the curb. I quickly but quietly mixed the concrete in my container, then carefully began filling his mailbox with it. I made sure to fill it completely, right up to the little flag. Then I closed the mailbox, wiped off any excess with a rag, and hurried home. By morning, that concrete would be rock solid. The best part? Tampering with a mailbox is a federal offense, but so is stealing packages that are delivered by the U.S. Postal Service. I figured we were even on that front. The next day, I casually walked my dog past Mr. President's house. I saw him loading luggage into his car, looking angry and talking on his phone. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but he was gesturing wildly at his mailbox. I smiled to myself and kept walking. Later that day, I noticed a postal worker examining the mailbox, shaking his head. By afternoon, the mailbox had been taped off with some kind of official-looking notice on it. I felt a twinge of guilt about causing problems for the Postal Service, but reminded myself who the real villain was here. Mr. President still left for his cruise, but I had a feeling he wasn't going to enjoy it as much as he'd planned. And while he was gone, I went into phase 2 of my plan. I had been collecting evidence of Mr. President's misconduct for months. The video of him stealing my package, documentation of arbitrary and inconsistent enforcement of HOA rules, testimony from neighbors who had similar experiences, and even some financial discrepancies I'd noticed in the HOA budget that suggested he might be misappropriating funds. I compiled all this information into a detailed report and sent it to every homeowner in the association, along with a petition to hold an emergency election to replace the entire board. I also included information about the legal limits of HOA power and how to contest unfair fines. The response was overwhelming. It turned out almost everyone in the neighborhood had a grievance against Mr. President and his cronies, but no one had been willing to stand up to them alone. My report gave them the courage and information they needed to fight back. By the time Mr. President returned from his cruise 2 weeks later, he found himself facing a full-blown revolution. Over 75% of homeowners had signed the petition for an emergency election. There was also an investigation pending into the financial discrepancies I'd pointed out. And as for the concrete mailbox, he never directly accused me, but he knew. I could see it in his eyes when he glared at me across the street. The postal inspector had apparently told him that tampering with a mailbox was a federal offense that could result in up to 3 years in prison and fines up to $250,000. But without evidence of who did it, there wasn't much they could do. Mr. President would have to pay to replace the mailbox himself, and until then, he'd have to pick up his mail at the post office every day. The emergency HOA election was scheduled for a month after Mr. President's return. During that time, he tried everything to maintain control. He sent out threatening letters about increased fines for violations. He tried to discredit me and others who were speaking out. And he even attempted to cancel the election altogether by claiming it violated the HOA bylaws. But the momentum was against him. His intimidation tactics only made people more determined to vote him out. And when the financial investigation revealed he had indeed been using HOA funds for personal expenses, including that fancy cruise he'd just taken, his fate was sealed. The day of the election arrived and the community center was packed. I had never seen so many of my neighbors in one place. Mr. President sat at the front table, stone-faced as the votes were counted. The result was unanimous, the entire board was voted out, and a new board was elected, with a friendly, reasonable neighbor as the new president. Mr. President stormed out without a word. The new board immediately voted to dismiss all pending fines and to conduct a full audit of the HOA finances. They also established new guidelines for rule enforcement that were fair and transparent. As for me, I was offered a position on the new board, but declined. I had done what needed to be done, but I didn't want to be part of any HOA leadership. I just wanted to live in peace in my home without being harassed. A week after the election, I received a check in the mail from the HOA for $350, compensation for my damaged collectible car, plus a little extra for the trouble. There was also a handwritten note from the new president apologizing for what I'd been through. Mr. President moved out of the neighborhood 2 months later. I heard through the grapevine that he was facing charges for embezzlement and might even do some jail time. I can't say I felt sorry for him. As for the concrete mailbox incident, no one ever proved it was me. Some neighbors had their suspicions, of course, and I sometimes caught them looking at me with a mix of fear and respect. But officially, it remained an unsolved mystery. Looking back, I'm not proud of taking matters into my own hands with the concrete. It was childish and potentially illegal. But sometimes, when you're backed into a corner by a bully who thinks they're untouchable, you have to find a way to fight back. And in this case, that ridiculous act of petty revenge was the spark that ignited a much-needed change in our community. Our neighborhood is a different place now. The HOA still exists, but it functions the way it should, as a tool for maintaining community standards, not as a weapon for harassment and personal power. People aren't afraid to speak up when they see problems, and decisions are made transparently with input from everyone. And me? I finally feel at home in my dream house. My lawn might occasionally be half an inch too tall, and sometimes my trash cans stay out a bit too long, but nobody's measuring or counting. We're just neighbors, living our lives, enjoying our homes. And if you visit, you might notice my new mailbox. It's extra large, made of heavy-duty steel, and firmly cemented into the ground, just in case anyone gets any ideas. HOA edit update. Wow, I didn't expect this post to blow up like it did. Thanks for all the support and awards, everyone. Since so many of you asked for an update, here's what's happened in the 6 months since this all went down. First off, the embezzlement case against Mr. President turned out to be even bigger than we initially thought. The full audit revealed he had been skimming from the HOA funds for at least 5 years, totaling over $75,000. He used the money for vacations, home renovations, and even a small boat, which he kept at his brother's lake house to avoid suspicion. He ended up taking a plea deal to avoid jail time, but he had to pay back everything he stole plus interest, and he's now on probation for 3 years. I saw his mugshot in the local paper and couldn't help but smile. As for our HOA, it's undergone a complete transformation. The new board has rewritten the bylaws to be much more reasonable, with clear guidelines for enforcement and a proper appeals process. They've also reduced the monthly dues since Mr. President isn't siphoning off money anymore. The best part? They've implemented a rotation system for the board, so no one person can stay in power for too long. Every year, at least 2 board positions must change hands. This prevents another power-hungry tyrant from taking control. Oh, and remember those cronies who backed up Mr. President? Turns out some of them were being manipulated, and others were getting kickbacks. 2 of them moved away shortly after he did, but one actually apologized to the community and has been working to make amends by volunteering for neighborhood cleanup events. My damaged collectible car model? I was able to repair it myself, and it now sits proudly in my collection as a reminder that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's scary. And finally, about that concrete-filled mailbox. The postal inspector eventually closed the case due to lack of evidence, but not before interviewing several neighbors, including me. I kept a poker face and simply stated I had no knowledge of who would do such a thing. The inspector gave me a long, knowing look, but ultimately just nodded and left. The funniest part? Our neighborhood has become something of a legend among local mail carriers. I overheard one telling a trainee, "Be careful in this neighborhood, they don't mess around if you misdeliver their packages." The trainee looked terrified while the senior carrier tried not to laugh. Life is good now. Our community has regular block parties, people help each other out, and there's a genuine sense of neighborliness that was missing before. Sometimes it takes a concrete situation to build a better foundation for the future. Thanks again for all your comments and support, and remember, always keep your HOA in check, your packages secure, and maybe invest in a good security camera, just in case. The next one is a malicious compliances story. I used to work on the retentions department of an ISP back in the day. While many people called genuinely wanting to cancel their phone service, just as many knew that retentions was more than that. The ISP, let's call them Red Phone, had two different departments. I worked on Retentions 1, where we did a lot of fixing bills and offering small discounts and slightly cheaper phones to customers who said they wanted to leave. Retentions 2 was for customers who were in the process of porting their numbers, and the worst thing they offered was a 50% discount for a couple of years with a decent phone for free. This happened roughly 10, maybe 12 years ago when roaming was straight up highway robbery. Let me introduce you to the executive. I got the call, I did my little introductory spiel, and I immediately discovered this guy was the most entitled POS I'd ever had the displeasure to speak to. He said he was a very important executive who traveled a lot for work, but the bill he got was ridiculous and I had to solve it or he was going to cancel his service. I muted him, so he heard nothing, but I could still hear what he said, and while I checked his account, I could hear him gloat to his girlfriend that he's getting the bill credited because he knows how to play the system, and he was an a-hole, but he wasn't wrong. This guy was a pro at playing Red Phone. He had the highest phone plan the company offered, which was around €90 at the time for one line, but paid €30 per month because he had discounts from both departments stacked on top of each other. His plan allowed him to get what at the time was a super expensive phone for basically nothing at Retentions 2. He'd gotten the super shiny customer status and the super shiny customer service line, which usually meant a customer was averaging a €300 monthly bill, despite his €30 ARPU because he complained about how the delocalized customer service sucked. He was also not wrong about his bill being ridiculous. He'd visited several EU countries, got a €600 bill called customer service, and said he had not known that roaming was so expensive. No one had warned him when he told us he was traveling overseas. The company had a policy that the first time a customer complained about something, we could refund them, particularly if the complaint was that the customer had not been informed about extra charges. So the rep informed him about roaming costs and refunded him all of the roaming charges, leaving the bill at €30. Second month comes around. He kept using the phone overseas, got a €1,500 bill. He calls customer service. They tell him they can't refund him again. He says he wants to cancel his account then and gets transferred to me. He was demanding that we credited his roaming charges again, because if we can do it once, we can do it again, and also because roaming prices were abusive. He did have a point there. I told him I couldn't do that, so he wanted me to open a claim and escalate it. I refused again because there was no one to escalate to. He wasn't going to get that credited. He insisted he wasn't hanging up until I escalated the issue because he wasn't informed, and if I kept the call going for much longer, he was going to charge the company for his time because he was a busy man. At this point, I'd been working there long enough that if you were nice or even normal, I would try my damnedest to help you. But if you were a prick, sorry, can't do, get lost. Customer refuses to hang up, I can hang up. This guy, though, he'd gone past being a prick into total idiot waffle, and I was pissed off. I couldn't be a prick back, but he'd been ducking around and I could make sure he found out. So I told him that okay, since he was so insistent, I would open a claim to refund him the €1,500 bill, and muted him while I opened the claim. The a-hole was again gloating at his girlfriend about how clever he was because he was going to get this bill refunded too. Meanwhile, I was copy-pasting the notes from the previous month's claim, where the rep had written, "I've informed customer of roaming charges in all the countries he told me he could be visiting, list of European countries. Also, stacking discounts? Very much not a thing." He had to spam the Retentions 1 call centers with calls until he got a newbie lost enough to apply another discount over his Retentions 2 discount. And he had not read the terms and conditions of the accounts, but I had. Trying to defraud the company was grounds for service termination. I got the claim number, flagged down my supervisor, and told her to please send it to headquarters in the daily report so fraud could examine the account. I told the guy that the claim had been opened, but also that, since it was obvious he was trying to abuse the company's policies, the claim had been flagged to be reviewed by fraud and it was likely his account would be terminated. He went from entitled to worried in 2 seconds and asked me to close the claim. Sorry, dude, can't do. You wanted a claim open, now it's open. Yes, the customer was fired. The next one is an entitled parent's story. It's taken me a while to confront how bad this situation really was. I've mulled over it so many times, and even now, I still wonder if I might be the one in the wrong. But many people I've talked to about this have agreed that this was messed up for my parents to do. I'll try to keep it as brief as I can. But there is a lot of context. I was in university when lockdown started in 2020, 21. My younger sister graduated during 2020, 18, and the youngest was in elementary school, 8. My older sister, 24, was engaged and still got married in the summer. I worked a job on campus to pay for university that I lost due to lockdown. Having no income, once my savings ran out, I was forced to move back home with my parents. My stepdad kept his job thanks to being moved to virtual, and my mom had just finished getting a graphic design degree. Thanks to all this, my parents suddenly had a lot more money. So they decided to move out of state. We were in WA at the time, citing that they wanted to get away from all the liberals. Luckily for my stepdad, his job then asked him to move to Texas. My parents wanted to sell the house by the end of October, and they decided this in August. The house had about 10 years worth of neglected projects that they now wanted to do it 2 months. Less than my older sister's wedding was in August. She kept it small, and we followed the proper regulations. But that meant we couldn't start on the house until mid-August. My younger sister and I were working manual labor jobs to earn money for collage. I worked on a farm as that was the only job I could get at the time, and my sister was a cleaner for some rich people in the area. My parents were fully aware of the jobs we had. No more than a week after my sister's wedding, projects on the house commenced. We had to fix up the backyard, repaint most of the inside and outside of the house, declutter, shampooed every carpet, and so much more. I would get up at 6 a.m., go to work, pull weeds out in the August and September sun until 4 p.m., then I was expected to come home and get straight to work on the house. No breaks. My younger sister was the same. We would work until 9 p.m. most weekdays. Then our Saturdays, from 9 a.m. to usually 8 p.m., we were working. And even on Sundays, we would come home from church and get straight to work until 8 p.m. We were working around the clock. I was not able to get as many hours as I needed to earn even close to what I needed because of my parents' expectations. Luckily, my sister's job paid her really well, but I wasn't so lucky. After only 2 weeks, I needed something to change. I physically could not keep up with this workload. So I decided to talk to my parents about it. My younger sister joined me. We tried to explain how tired we were and how we just needed a break for a bit. But my mom would not hear it. All she heard was, "We are lazy and don't want to help." My mom turned into a ragging monster, screaming at us, telling us she was doing so much, working her butt off every day, and we hardly lifted a finger. Meanwhile, I would come home from work, covered in mud, to her binging Supernatural, and could tell she'd watched many episodes that day because I was the one that introduced it to her after watching it myself, and she'd just be sitting on the couch doing nothing. Then she threatened to kick us out if we didn't help, knowing full well there was nowhere to go because of lockdown. After that, she stormed to her room and slammed the door. My stepdad heard the commotion and heard my mom's side of the story first, and came down and berated my sister and I for being lazy and ungrateful, and laid down the law. We had to keep up the amount of work we were doing or leave, but he was so gracious to give us a 30-minute break after coming home from our jobs. I think now is a great time to point out that the room they were so graciously letting my live in was the craft study room. It was a communal room. Correction, I had a bed in this room. The rest of the room was not mine to use. I had zero privacy. I had to get changed in the bathroom most of the time because people would just walk in whenever. And I had half of a 3-by-5-foot closet and half of the communal coat closet to store my belongings. But they were being so generous for letting me live there. I owed them anything they asked for. Yeah, needless to say, after another week of this grueling work, I had to make the decision to quit my job. My younger sister followed suit about a week or so later, and naturally, now that we had more free time, my parents swooped in and increased our workloads. Now it was 12-hour days aside from Sunday, where Sunday was 6-ish. Finally, in October, it was time to put the house on the market, and we could finally rest. The house sold for almost 100K more than the originally estimate before the work we'd done. And less than a month later, we had to pack the whole house and clean it. So for another month, we pulled 12-hour days, sorting things and packing boxes. Once we finally moved out, my parents dropped my sister and I's stuff in the collage town on their way down to Texas, which my sister and I helped them drive the 2 cars, packed to the brim with stuff. In Texas, my parents rented as 2-bedroom Airbnb for 5 adults, 1 child, 2 cats, and 2 dogs. My brother and his dog came to stay with us for Christmas. While there, I finally sat down and confronted my financial situation. I had just enough to cover rent for a semester, but not tuition thanks to having to quit early. I talked to my parents about this, and they told me, sounds like a you problem. So I ended up having to pull out loans to pay for the next few semesters until I got my job back. Meanwhile, my parents bought themselves new cars and new furniture for their new house off the money we helped them earn. Yes, I could have stayed with them and gotten another job and just took a semester off. But they moved to a super rural area with no jobs near them and they were toxic as crap. I would rather go into debt than live with them ever again. But on the bright side, I do believe in karma, or that God does his job in subtle ways, whichever you prefer. My stepdad got himself a better job for a year after, then got himself fired because he stole some monitors from a job site. It took him about 6 months to get a new job and had to take a pay cut. Now they are having to sell their new house again, without my sister and I's help. My youngest sister is pretty good at getting out of helping, so now they really do have to do everything themselves this time. Yay! Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.